and welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, your serving of drinks culture and the people who drive it. I'm JC Tops. This week we're discussing all things French wine. With numerous prestigious wine regions, wines from France are iconic. Some might even argue that French wines set the bar for other countries and wine producers. With such iconic and old world status, can France do anything new? I sat down with Jon Bonné to discuss his newly released book, The French Wine, and what's changing throughout one of the oldest wine-producing regions in the world. Currently the managing editor at Resi, Jon has served as senior contributing editor for Punch, and for nearly a decade, he was an award-winning editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. And prior to the new French Wine, he also authored the new California Wine. So listen on as Jon explains why he decided to write about the iconic wine-producing country, what he thought about French wine when he started his research, what regions surprised him, and what his main takeaway was from writing his 800-page, 2-volume book. Hi, I'm JC Tops, and today my guest is Jon Bonné. Currently the managing editor at Resi, Jon Bonné is an award-winning journalist and author. Jon's background includes MSNBC, Seattle Magazine, The Washington Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle, and of course many others. He is the author of The New California Wine and his latest book, The New French Wine. Welcome, Jon. I'm so glad you can join us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
So you have quite a background in food and wine.
I've been eating and drinking for a long time, yeah.
I'm really interested in when you got started and when your interest in food and wine started.
Really early. I couldn't tell you exactly when, but certainly in single digits. So the explanation is my father had an interesting career. He was a corporate executive, but he also trained as a chef. And so he went back and forth a little bit between those two things. And when we were growing up, he was cooking all the time at home, and we were drinking very good wine from, again, a notably young age. And he ran a gourmet foods and catering business for a while. And so it was just, my sister and I grew up with it really always around, and I don't think we even thought much of it until much later. Clearly it did something, because now she runs a winery in Sonoma and I do what I do. So it was, it made its way into our heads, but it was just always there. And then I sort of forgot all about it. Not like forgetting entirely, but just, you go off to college and other things occupy you, whatever, and started doing internet stuff, started doing journalism. And it really wasn't until around sort of like turn of the millennium and about the time I ended up at MSNBC that I started getting interested in it again.
Okay. So your career in journalism, when it started, it wasn't in food and wine initially.
No, it actually was in public radio, and I was doing all kinds of stuff. I was reporting a lot in New York. It was public radio station in New York, and so it was covering, politics and culture and also the sort of weird New York stuff. And then when I graduated, I got into the internet really early and did like internet ad stuff and other stuff, and then really missed journalism, went back and was doing sort of like hard news and general news, and again, like politics, environment, drug policy, all kinds of stuff. So honestly, when I started like sneaking wine and food into my stories, I was a business reporter at MSNBC, and I found that I kept going out to Eastern Washington because I was based in Seattle at that point, and there was not only lots of interesting sort of hard news stories out there, but there were a lot of vineyards, and I was really getting back into wine at that point and kept sneaking it into stories. And finally, one day, just sort of suckered my editor into giving me a wine column. And that's how it all began to unravel.
Oh my God, I love that. I love how you're like, I'm going to sneak some wine into this story.
I mean, it's way, way more interesting than writing about like rental cars and mortgages. So.
Right, exactly. Okay, so you are covering wine and you're a wine critic and you're writing for various publications. At what point did you decide that you wanted to write a book about California wine?
So by that point, I was the wine editor and chief wine critic at the San Francisco Chronicle, one of the unicorn jobs, and
Yes, it is.
I yeah, and I had taken the job, maybe not fully thinking through how I felt about California wine at the time. This was like the mid 2000s, and it was really the the end of what in New California wine I called the era of big flavor, which was just like more is more, Robert Parker, all the scores, all the oak, all the things, 16% alcohol, just it was a moment. And I showed up in California sort of at the late decadent moment of that, and I knew that I didn't like those wines very much. I maybe should have thought twice about taking a job in California covering California wine, but I had a very different vision of California wine that came from an earlier time, and I was always curious to find people who just hadn't gone down that path or had gone down that path and decided they didn't like it, like Copan, where Wells sort of pursued all those things and then realized he didn't really like the wines he was making, and not just the style of the wines, but also culturally. I think I was never quite comfortable with where Napa especially had gone, and became a perennial pain in the ass for the people in Napa who have the money and control all the things. It felt like it was tonally off from the way that I had, A, remembered California in an earlier time, and B, just where to me the wine world was. And so I kept sort of poking at that for a while, and eventually wrote a piece for Saveur called "The New California Wine" that put together the threads of like a lot of people I'd been following, who now we sort of talk about, in a familiar way, Steve Mathiasen and Lioko and Arnott Roberts, Brock Sellers, people like that. But at the time, this was all very unknown, and so they commissioned me to write a piece sort of tying these threads together, and that, as magazine pieces do, got turned into a book proposal. And I think by the time I started writing it, it was clear that there was a very big sea change underway in California, and I was incredibly lucky to have been there, sort of, chronicling it and getting to know the people and tasting the wines, and helping to provide a bit of a platform for everything that was happening.
Okay. Okay, that's great. So let's talk about the new French wine.
Yeah.
Why did you want to write about French wine? I mean, I love French wine. I'm super excited about this book. I'm one of the French wine reviewers for Wine Enthusiast. So, it was so great to do like a deep dive into the country. Why did you want to take on French wine?
So the glib answer would be, having like dropped the mic on California, then you turn and you're like, well, where else can I torment? But no, but legitimately, I wish I had a better origin story for the book, but New California was out. This was 2014, and you know, it had done really well. I was, like sort of thrilled at just the reception, and how, more than that, just how people were seeing or sharing in this crazy vision I had of where California was going. And so I was looking for other ideas, and had some sense of like maybe I should do something on the old world, and I don't know, like France, Spain, Italy, like what threads can I see, and was just kind of thinking through things. And then, as one does, went out drinking with my editor to a natural wine bar in Oakland, and probably drank a little too much unsulfured Gamay. And anyone who wants to pick on natural wine, I can tell you this is what happens when you do that.
Exactly.
She's like, so what about France? Like New France. I'm like, sure, that's a great idea. Like, yeah, we'll bang it out. A couple years, it'll be awesome. And famous last words. Had no idea what I was getting myself into, but even it's interesting when I was putting the book proposal together for the new French wine. Even then, I thought I had a sense of here's some things on the fringe and some people doing Vin de France and all the crazy, not like natty wine that's out there. And, and there's kind of an alternate story for France, which would have been fine. And in some ways, like other folks have attempted that book. But what I realized probably the second or third trip in when I actually started reporting it was the things that were changing in France were not in any way in the fringe. And it was, it had similarity to California, but it was a very different thing in that the entire French wine industry was in the midst of radical change. And it's funny because people think of France as the not only the North Star of wine, but also very rigid and unchanging. And what I was discovering is that that was as far from the truth as could be, that things were moving so fast there. And it wasn't just these interesting things around the edges, although those were good indicators, but they weren't really the whole story. And the whole story was that in one way or another, and really in different ways in different regions, that the French wine industry was transforming itself in a way I had not expected and I really didn't have a context for. And what I realized, and again, like it would take years, was that basically the French wine industry was undergoing what I argue in the book is the biggest change that it has had in about 150 years since before phylloxera. That where things are now are so profoundly different than where they were 30 years ago that you can draw the connections, you can see how we got there, but it's just all the things that people loved about French wine are actually still there, but even better, along with all these new things that were never there before.
Wow, uh, that is so fascinating. So let's back up a bit.
Yeah,
So
just it's not a small yacht.
it's a beautiful box set. It's 2 volumes, over 850 pages. How long did it take you to write this book? And what year was it when you started writing it? Well, researching it and writing it.
Yeah. So the contract got signed end of 2014, and I actually had already started researching it by then. And we shipped it to the printer in late 2022. So it took 8 years.
Oh, wow. I was not expecting that answer.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this was obviously
Neither was I when I started the project.
right. Exactly. So a lot of this was also taking place during COVID, a lot of your research and writing the book.
I mean, yeah, the last part of it was I think I did my last sort of official reporting trip in 2019, like mid 2019, and then I was sort of hardcore writing. And I actually did go back and do a couple trips during COVID, small ones, but I don't even know that I would have done more because there was just so much writing to do. But I suppose being holed up in your house for 3 years is a good way to focus yourself on writing. Having a full time
To bang
job,
out a book.
yeah, tended to complicate that a little bit. But it was also like I started it. I was still living in San Francisco, moved back to New York, and then obviously was spending a ton of time in France. So yeah, it was in every way the scope of it ended up bigger than I had envisioned, than my agent had envisioned, than my editor had envisioned, than anyone who ever would have put up with me for trying to do this silly project would have imagined.
So were you living in France for like, I mean, are your trips were like a week or a month or like was it 3 months or 6 months? How long were you in France doing your research?
I more or less split the year for maybe 4-ish years. Part of it is we actually bought an apartment in Paris in the course of this, which sounds incredibly glamorous, but for anyone who lives in New York, it is a
Right.
shockingly pragmatic real estate decision. It's maybe a third of what it costs to buy in New York, so it's maybe the one good like real estate investment I've ever made. But so some of it was just literally having a home base, but even then, you have to go out, you have to go to each region. So typically, my trips would be about 3 weeks, which was about as long as I could go, just routine would be about 6 days a week, maybe 4 to 5 visits a day. And so it's just, and visits are around 2 hours because like you want to spend some time with the producer. You want to, not just taste the wine, but see the vineyards and, get a bit of gestalt and kind of understand what they're up to. And so it was just, it's at some point you're like, this is the maximum I can absorb without a break. So that was more or less the routine. I think it ended up something like 30 or 35 trips in total, and of varying lengths, and sometimes tacking on some time in Paris or not or what have you. But it was a lot of back and forth, and as nutty as that sounds, I don't know that even like living in France full time would have necessarily been a better solution, because it didn't really matter in some way, because I had to go, I literally had to go to like every corner of France to see what was going on. And I'm sure that there are ways that smarter people could have shortcut this, but it became apparent to me that like I had to have boots on the ground and go see what was going on, go get a feel for not just the wine, but the culture in the regions and whether it was progressing or not. And so, yeah, I mean, it's on the one hand, that sounds like a great French vacation. On the other hand, like, if anyone wants to hang out in Airbnbs in like little towns for a couple years, like I don't know that I recommend it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people think that writing a book sounds really cool, and I guess definitely I guess it would seem that way. I've never written a book, but but I know that it's a lot of reporting and a lot of boots on the ground, as you say, and it's not all fun and games sometimes.
Well, and to be fair, not to like throw too much shade on authors, but wine writing is hard, and it's not typically very lucrative. And certainly, my advance for this book was about as good an advance as anyone's going to get for a wine book. But I think you often see with a lot of books that it just wasn't. Whether it was that the author didn't want to, or that they literally couldn't afford to. Go and do that work in person. There tends to be a lot of shortcutting, and it's just, I mean, I think it's a reality of where like wine journalism is. And again, like if I was in any way sane, I probably should have done more of that. But I think I felt that if I didn't go, I wasn't going to get the story I wanted.
So, I mean, and the book is, like, so well reported. It's so comprehensive, so it definitely shows. I mean, it shows that you did the work.
Yeah, and probably too much, and it will shock many people. But we actually cut a lot in order to like get the book, quote unquote, down to size. Uh,
Right. Down to the 2 volumes.
yeah.
Okay, so one volume is called The Producers, and the other one is called The Narrative. So what's going on in these 2 volumes?
So we were trying to figure out the exact format of this book, and structure is actually a really important thing to me, in that books are meant to entertain, but certainly wine books are also tools. And I honestly like started out with the geographic chapters and then tacked the wineries onto the end of each chapter, which is a pretty standard format. And then we literally got to this point where we were probably not going to be able to put it all in one volume because like the spine would crack. And so we started talking about 2 volumes, and I think what we landed on was that people people access different types of wine books in different ways. And my brand, if you will, is to try and tell a story and to place people in wherever I'm writing about. And that ultimately is what the narrative is. And it's all the geographic regions. There's some interstitial chapters where talk about climate, talk about farming, talk about appellations. But it was really being able to tell the story sort of beginning to end of everything that was happening, to explain geography, things like that. And then conceptually, you could try and read it beginning to end. It's a lot, but in theory. And then in terms of the producers, at some point, same thing. Like realized we had a lot of producers, and even with pretty severe editing down, there were just there's so many new talented vignerons in France that, even having to do some triage on it, like there were going to be a lot. They ended up with over 800. And when people are looking for that information in a wine book, they don't want to dig through all the other stuff. They're looking for the producer they're interested in. They want to reference it and go and read it and be done. And so I think it was just acknowledging that like people use those two different types of information in different ways, and the best thing we could do, just from a what I guess would now be called a UX perspective, would be to split them out and to let people use the two different volumes in totally different ways.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a reference book. I mean, you can just keep going back to it. I mean, to look up anything about the country and wine, and it's great, and it's very well organized.
Which, I think that my editor and our indexer will very much appreciate that, because God, it wasn't organized when we started.
So let's talk about the actual wine and like in your takeaway. Like I think it's in the narrative volume, right? Where it starts off with this chapter about patrimony. Is that how you pronounce it? Or what is
Patrimoine, yeah.
old what is old new again? Is that one of the takeaways or like the main takeaway that you got from writing the book about the country and wine?
It is. And I think that was just about the last chapter I wrote, because as much as anything, I needed time to get my head around everything that I'd seen, everything that I'd experienced, all the, 15 notebooks worth of reporting, all of it. And I honestly, again, like when I started, I thought it was going to be, this is all net new. This is new stuff that, that doesn't really have a precedent. And over time, what I realized is that the one big parallel to the New California is that one of the theses in New California wine was like a lot of what was happening in California wasn't out of the blue. It actually had very strong reference to the historic wine industry there, and a lot of things that existed in the 19th century before everyone was so sure of themselves, and before, as industries do, it tended to sort of to calcify, that all those things were coming back in a more progressive, modern, contemporary way. And what I realized as I really started to dig into the deeper research with France was that almost everything that is happening there today has a precedent, and very specifically a similar time frame, kind of the mid 19th century, after the revolution and before phylloxera, when wine was one of the true economic staples of France. And it was, it was in almost every department in France, and it wasn't nearly as stratified and as class driven and as status driven as it is today, or let's say was at the end of the 20th century. That there was enormous diversity in terms of grapes and farming and practices and all kinds of things, and this true sense of a deep culture that had been very, very significantly narrowed, first through phylloxera and then fraud and then World War. And so by the time the post-war wine industry it emerged in France, it was a very narrow, constricted version of itself. And so the fact that I was discovering all of this diversity, people bringing back, varieties like Jean Saint Noir that hadn't really been planted for a century, it was great in terms of the curiosity and the evolution. But in fact, you could find that it had some version of that had taken place 100, 120 years ago, which is where what's old is new again came from. And in France, it's particularly important because of this sense of patrimoine, which isn't quite history. It's a very specific cultural view of history, where you are preserving the cultural lineage of what has come before. And it's interesting because the French talk about it all the time, and yet if you see the way a lot of wine appellations, for instance, are written in France, literally in French law, it's this very kind of buffed up, polished version of patrimoine, of the past, of past culture. And so part of what I wanted to do to set the tone for the book was say, you know, there is, in fact, enormous historical precedent for this, but it's not necessarily what you think.
Wow. That's a huge takeaway.
Yeah. And as I said, I write in the chat, it was like, I spent a lot of time alone sort of driving around and, thinking and writing in notebooks. And it was literally like on the side of a road outside Cahors in the Southwest. And I just like pulled the car over and like grabbed my notebook. I was like, I finally got it. And, it just was tying together a thousand threads. But the more I honestly pressure tested it as a thesis, like the more it became clear that, you know, everywhere I looked, this was ultimately what was happening.
And now a word from our sponsor. I love shopping at Total Wine, as there is always something new for me to try. And even better, I know I'll always get it for the lowest price. Like the other day, I was looking for a Kentucky bourbon as a gift for Dad, and I found myself a great Prosecco for under $8 and a French Rosé for under $7. With those low prices, I had to get both. I can't wait to see what I find during my next visit to Total Wine. With the lowest prices for over 30 years, always find what you love and love what you find. Only at Total Wine & More. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly. B21. Were there anything new, like actually emerging, like new trends that are happening in France that were not happening in France at some point?
So there's bits and pieces around the edge. I think if you look at specific winemaking techniques, that does mark some new things. Some of it is what's happening everywhere. Everyone needs amphora. Everyone needs their weird vessels of choice. I think maceration is not entirely new because you look and there's lots of potential precursors to things like light red wine, which a century ago was just called Arbois Rosé, and now we call it Trousseau and we drink it in Bushwick. But if you look, for instance, in Alsace and the way that people are going back to grapes like Pinot Gris and Gewürztraminer and actually macerating what are not really white grapes and are making them as orange wines, that's kind of net new for France, but is in fact, I think, very much in line with the real nature of those grapes. There's certainly improvements to farming, and probably the biggest change in some way, which is not a deliberate one, but the responses to it have obviously been deliberate, is climate. And so, for 1,000 years, let's say, the presumption in French agriculture was that you were in a marginal climate, you would probably not get your grapes fully ripe. If you had a really great vintage, you might get them to 11 or 12% alcohol. But on balance, there was a deficiency of photosynthesis in France, to be very, very wonky about it. And really, let's say maybe 20, 25 years, and to some extent, like let's talk champagne, in 10 or 12 years, the absolute inverse has arrived, which is to say that a long tradition of farming that presumed you would never get enough ripeness, you'd add sugar to the wines, you'd have to compensate in some way, has suddenly been flipped on its head, and there is complete maturity in the grapes. They're getting ripe enough, not too ripe. In somewhere like Champagne, this goes from the entire reason that Champagne exists as a sparkling wine in a way was because you couldn't make a drinkable still wine in the region, or it was very hard. And now suddenly you can grow base wine for Champagne that's completely ripe at 12 degrees, and you have to suddenly adapt to, well, you're not adding sugar and making up for deficiencies and insane acidity. The wines come out completely formed, so that suddenly means that you can make single parcel expressions without it being a constant challenge. It means that the availability of really high quality base material is available to like every grower, and so it's probably the one thing that I think has forced more change onto French wine than anything else. Not necessarily in a bad way. I think everyone talks about climate as a crisis, and in the
Mhm.
larger human future existence sense, it absolutely is. In the very narrow and selfish realm of French viticulture, Climate has been at the very least a mixed bag, but there is enormous potential for ever better wines to come out of it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. Well, I asked the question about, new because I think that, France has this reputation, I mean, and rightly so, for being so rigid and having these very, very strict rules and regulations. And are they doing new things? Like, can they do new things? I think is kind of what people are interested in and kind of want to know.
And so think about like the rise of Vin de France, and this is very closely tied to the natural wine movement there, where these are vignerons who are they don't feel that the rules serve them anymore, or they don't receive the appellation. You actually have to be approved to use it. So what do? They make the wine they want. They put Vin de France on it, and they sell it. And traditionally in France, Vin de France or Vin de Table was like the worst, cheapest crap wine out there. And kind of like with the Super Tuscans, this was inverting the reputation of a label, so that now like all the cool fun wines are in Vin de France. Not all of them, but you know, that's it has become a tool for winemakers who really want to pursue the avant-garde. What I didn't realize until I really started spending time there is that this wasn't a fashion statement. I mean, in a few cases it was, but this was almost always vignerons who worked in a specific appellation, like a known appellation, let's say Alexander Bain in Pouilly-Fumé. They had every desire to use the appellation, to make appellation wine, to find a personal expression, and the rules combined with sort of old grudges, local politics, all the things that hold French wine and many other things back, were just making it impossible. And so when they left the system, they didn't leave the system as a deep rebellious statement. They left because the system wasn't serving their purposes. And I think, so there's tons of new in France, and some of it falls within the old rules, some of it doesn't. But I don't think that there's tons of vignerons there who are seeking to tear down the system. I think they wish the system would work for them. I think they largely hope that they can change it or evolve it, and they leave as a last resort. And so what we see perhaps on the far end as being net new and not following in the rules is them trying to make it work and simply realizing that there isn't a pathway that allows them to do what they want to do.
Right, right. I love how you explain Vin de France. That's actually one of my regions where I've actually reviewed for wine enthusiasts.
Well, you're probably seeing like there's these wines that it's I mean it's it's in the French hive mind. It's kind of crappy sort of table wine, but it's not that at all anymore, and it represents literally everything and every region, except Champagne, where it's literally illegal to make anything but champagne, which is the cause of some frustration there. But yeah, I mean, you probably know better than me. Like Vin de France could be so much now.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, like, there are definitely some producers that are doing some great things, and it's blowing my mind. So yeah, I 100% agree. I'm curious, is were there any particular regions that surprised you at all? With like you had an idea about a particular region and you went in and you came out, like your mind was changed about something, or you were surprised.
There were. I had a vague sense, but I didn't really know until I went there and spent time how remarkably Muscadet is transforming itself. And really the whole sort of Western Loire, like far Western Loire. I figured it was this kind of, sleepy little region. Nantes was kind of a sleepy port town, and literally rolled into Nantes one day and was my mind was blown. It's one of the youngest, greenest cities in France. It's a tech hub. Like everyone's riding around on free bike share. There's all these chefs who left Paris and other cities to cook there because you have a young, affluent clientele who you know, they spend money, they love eating, they love drinking local wine, they have all the produce of the Loire and all the seafood of Brittany. And Muscadet has basically kind of undergone the same transformation that Beaujolais has, except for white wine, where there's now 10 crews. You can very specifically tell the differences in geology and in taste and terroir. And the quality has absolutely rallied. And some of the best white wines in France are now being made there from what used to be considered kind of cheap oyster wine. Roussillon blew me away. I didn't really have an expectation, but I figured it would be sort of the remnants of the old fortified wine industry, and just the both the interest in creating the net new, like creating dry fresh wines from banyuls, literally, like which used to have, used to be sort of the old head trained Grenache, like absolutely astonished me. And especially the fact that they're like 20 years ahead of almost anywhere else in France, and even some parts of California, in thinking about how to modulate ripeness for the sun. And so, like, you would go visit the folks in Kals, like the Gobi family, and talk to them, and they were thinking about things that, like, only the most progressive farmers in California were thinking about. And the third place I'll throw in as a ringer is is Bordeaux, which I figured was going to be an incredibly depressing region to write about. And I would just sort of perfunctorily go and, do what I had to do and be done. And there is a lot in Bordeaux that's really depressing. There's the word that one of the vignerons used there is feudal, and I think that's very appropriate. But it's fascinating because even with that, there is so much progress and so much momentum to change. And so my goal was to find 50 producers in Bordeaux who I felt were really contributing to deep change in what is France's greatest, like biggest fine wine region. And went back for 3 trips, 3 long trips. Ended up with, I don't know, 52 or 53. Could have, for sure, if I had kept going at it, found more. But it just became very important to me because it's a region that I did grew up really liking to drink, not like fancy Bordeaux, but just cheap Bordeaux. But it's also, it's Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. It's wines that people like inherently like to drink. And so, my thing was, if you can figure out how Bordeaux can change, then you can figure out how anywhere in France can change.
Yeah, I love that. Exactly. I absolutely love that idea. So now that you've dropped the mic on French wine, what regions what countries are you thinking about next?
What's in the crosshairs? It's a good question. I wish I had a clear answer. Italy would be interesting. I know with certainty that I will not do that because I just got through 8 years of France, and if you think
Yeah,
France is
that's no fun.
complicated, welcome to Italy.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let someone who actually speaks Italian and has 15 years of their life to spend on that do that one. Um, I mean, personally, the book that I would love to do would be the new Australian one.
That's a good one.
My publisher might feel otherwise. I think that's complicated in that there is so much incredibly interesting stuff that's going on there, like even more radical than like all the stuff in California, a lot of the stuff in France. It's one of these things when wine industries truly industrialize, then when the inevitable snapback happens, it happens in relative proportion to how much the industry went overboard. And when you think about how far Australia went to like making completely boring, lifeless, like unremarkable wines, the way in which that's unraveling now is amazing. And so, someday in my spare time when, money is no object, I will for sure do that. Honestly, right now, I am trying to figure it out. There's lots of amazing things happening. I feel like I should not be the only one to chronicle it. So a little bit TBD.
Okay. I mean, I think you deserve a break too after
Yeah,
8 years of
yeah.
French
I'm
wine.
going to Disneyland.
Yeah. One final question for you. What's in your glass? What are you drinking these days?
Um, it's kind of all over the place. I it being sort of the end of spring, I've gone through now I think annual tradition of drinking an enormous amount of Vermentino slash Pigato slash roll slash whatever. Like that was one of the really interesting things, which I think doesn't quite have a form yet in France, but you see in Corsica especially, like the quality of Vermentino-based white wines is just astonishing.
Mhm.
Um, there's always an enormous amount of Beaujolais in my glass. I am following my own thesis that Beaujolais is the new Burgundy and drinking every last drop of it I can while I can still afford
Mhm.
it. Um, and honestly, like evermore, there's sake in my glass. Um,
Ooh,
it's
that's surprising.
it's something it's something I've drunk for a long time, but it's just like the past few years, I think even during COVID, the quality of like artisan sake that again sort of falls outside the traditional lines of what people like think they know about sake has really just boomed. And so it's fun for me because it's legitimately something that I get to explore and not feel like I'm a know-it-all, which I tend to be on many.
Jon Bonné, thank you so much for joining us. It has been such a pleasure. Your book is amazing.
Thank you. Pleasure's all.
And I look forward to reading the next one whenever that break ends.
Thanks so much.
Has the past reshaped the future? Is what's old new again in French wine? Well, that's not for me to say. Maybe we should all grab a glass of our favorite French wine and check out Jon's latest book to find out. If you like today's episode, we love to read your reviews and hear what you think. And hey, why not tell your wine-loving friends to check us out too? Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. You can also go to wineenthusiasts.com/podcast for more episodes and transcripts. I'm JC Tops. Thanks for listening.